Hello everyone, you're watching WION World is One. Welcome to WION-VOA Co-Production. I'm Shivan Channa. Let's get to the point. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the challenge posed by China has prompted Britain to publish an updated defense strategy this week. Now, as the country tries to balance external threats against financial constraints back at home, Voice of America's Henry Ridgwell reports from London. Listen in.
Britain's so-called integrated review refresh says Russia's invasion of Ukraine means the West's collective security is now intrinsically linked to the outcome of the conflict.
It's forced the UK to acknowledge that our most immediate threats come much closer to home, and actually that the UK is in a really strong position, as the last year has shown, to provide military support to allies in Europe, particularly on Europe's eastern front.
On top of Britain's $58 billion annual defence spending, the review commits an additional $6 billion over the next 2 years. Of that, $2.3 billion will be spent on replenishing ammunition stocks that have been depleted through military aid given to Ukraine. The review reiterated Britain's ambition to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, but the target of meeting that goal by 2030 has been removed.
If the UK really wants to be global Britain, wants to be a force on the world stage, wants to be at the front of the pack when it comes to responding to Russia or to China, then we need more money to do that. At the moment, we're trying to run a first-rate military, which is up there competing with, the US and China and Russia, on a second-rate economy, because we're lagging behind many other of our peers at the moment.
Britain's posture toward China has gained much attention. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said China poses an epoch-defining challenge.
It's a country with fundamentally different values to ours, and its behaviour over the past few years has been concerning. More authoritarian at home, more assertive overseas.
But Sunak stopped short of labelling China a threat, despite pressure from some in his party.
That China's policy can change, and no one knows whether or not China will invade Taiwan, whether or not China will continue down this more assertive path. So I think the UK government wants to keep its options open, and I think the UK also recognises that China will be an important country to work with on addressing global challenges.
An additional $3.6 billion will be spent to support the delivery of nuclear-powered submarines for the Australian Navy as part of the AUKUS Indo-Pacific Defence Pact with the US and Australia. Beijing said the deal put the region on a dangerous path. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Joining us now is Voice of America's Jessica Stone, live from the White House. Jessica, glad to have you here with us. Jessica, this week Moscow and Washington have been involved in a conflict over an encounter between an American unmanned drone and a Russian fighter jet over the Black Sea. Now, what's the latest on that front?
Well, the conflict certainly elicited the first communication between defense ministers since October. We had Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia, talking with Lloyd Austin, the U.S. defense secretary, this week about this matter. And in addition, the Pentagon released 42 seconds of edited footage, edited down from 30 minutes, which it says shows the encounter between the Russian jet and the unmanned American drone. It says it proves what the U.S. has been saying, which is that the Russian jet poured fuel on the unmanned drone, then clipped its propeller, and the drone was ultimately forced down into the Black Sea. Now, Washington says that the drone was on a routine mission in international airspace. Moscow says, though, that it was actually in Russian airspace and that it did not get forced down by the Russian jet. Instead, it was forced down just because of its own operation. Meantime, a top U.S. military commander is basically saying this is par for the course. This has been, they've seen an uptick, he says, of these types of, quote, unprofessional and unsafe behavior on the part of Russian Air Force. They're actually seeing this in Syria as well, with unsafe flights, the U.S. military claims, of Russian Air Force planes going over the U.S. military base there in Syria. Shivan?
Jessica, of course, there have been opposing views from the opposing nations, but the conversation now moves to whether Russia will recover the drone from the sea and what security risks that might pose to the United States. Now, what can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this is an important question, of course. We saw this in the case of military hardware left behind in Afghanistan, or think about Abbottabad in Pakistan after the raid on Osama bin Laden. Russia is saying that it is looking for this drone, but the U.S. military maintains, look, this is U.S. property. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said earlier this week that it's going to be difficult to get to this drone because the water where it fell is more than 4,000 feet deep. So it's a deep location. And of course, the U.S. has no ships in the Black Sea. So in order to recover its own property, it's going to have to rely on allies to do so. Washington does say, though, that it was able to erase sensitive data on that drone before it went down. Shivan?
Thank you for those updates, Jessica. But do stay with us. We'll come back to you after these updates. Now, from 5G infrastructure to smartphones and more, Chinese technology is permeating many parts of the world. It's a part of China's digital Silk Road initiative, which is getting mixed reviews. Welcomed by some nations while others assess its potential risks. Voice of America's Elizabeth Lee brings us this report on the ever-expanding reach of Chinese tech.
From phones to computers, what connects people in many parts of the world is Chinese technology. China calls its global tech effort the Digital Silk Road. Launched in 2015, Beijing describes it as the technology dimension of China's Belt and Road Initiative, with a scope that runs from the ocean into space. Germany has Chinese technology, but is considering whether to ban Chinese 5G equipment.
These strict checks for potential security risks now also apply to the existing components in telecommunication networks, and that these existing components will also be critically checked in the next few months.
The Chinese embassy in Berlin responded that it is puzzled and strongly dissatisfied by Germany's actions. In the U.S., strong restrictions on Chinese technology started under former President Donald Trump, who cited national security concerns. In the UK, Huawei technology must be removed from its 5G networks by the end of 2027. Here's how China responded to the British decision in 2020.
The United Kingdom, with no concrete evidence under the pretext of risks that don't exist at all, has cooperated with the United States to discriminate against, oppress, and exclude Chinese enterprises.
Security concerns over the ability for Beijing to spy with Chinese technology and control of the telecommunications infrastructure have raised alarms in some Western countries, but nations from Southeast Asia to Africa have welcomed China's offers of a cheaper path to digital connectivity, says Mayan Nawans, a Chinese security expert.
So in Africa, I think the conversations are a little different, as they will be in other developing and emerging economies, where the emphasis is not so much on security concerns, but predominantly on how Chinese companies can help these countries develop their digital economies.
While several countries beyond China provide options for tech equipment such as phones, there is one area of digital competition where the U.S. and China are the main players, says financial risk expert Robert Green.
Cloud services and cloud computing is a very big area to focus on.
While competition between countries may happen at the geopolitical level, analysts say it also impacts consumers.
Understanding this larger geopolitical context is really important for the average consumer to understand that we're not necessarily dealing with another government that operates in the same way as our government does.
As with any technology, Nguyen says consumers should think about how much they trust the tech they use and weigh the risks that technology may pose as to who is storing personal data and how the information is being used. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News.
We're once again joined by Voice of America's Jessica Stone now. Jessica, TikTok is in the headlines once again in the United States because the Biden administration is calling for a nationwide ban on the company, unless, of course, it separates from its parent company, ByteDance. Now, what are the concerns at play here, and how likely is this ban to actually take place?
Well, the conversation, as Elizabeth Lee's report rightly points out, really does go back to the Trump administration that was already working on issues of national security with regard to Huawei, to ZTE, and of course now to TikTok. And the Biden administration has continued that level of concern, literally saying, as did the Trump administration, that because ByteDance is headquartered and run in China, that it would not be able to turn down a request from the Chinese government to part with data stored on its servers or that goes through its servers. And that is the main concern of the U.S. government. Already TikTok, as a result of those concerns, is banned on U.S. government phones. We saw this week that the British have also banned the use of TikTok on government phones there. The European Commission has done the same. And, you know, TikTok's response has been to outline a plan to move American data to U.S. servers housed by Oracle. And they say that that is, they call that Project Texas. They say that is going to protect American data. But just last week, we had a TikTok former employee tell Congress, look, I don't think that Project Texas is actually going to protect American users. Their data is still at risk. And so on the whole, we really have bipartisan agreement in Congress, a rarity, as we've talked about here in Washington, about the concerns around Chinese technology, its ability to filter American user data, whereabouts, GPS data, private information, identity information. And they're also concerned actually about TikTok and its ability to promote and distribute Chinese propaganda, the Chinese perspective or version of events that the Americans don't want necessarily to be fed to American citizens. So TikTok really does have this choice before it, that they've just been given this ultimatum by the Biden administration: either divorce yourself from ByteDance and sell off the American part of TikTok, or be banned nationwide. And that is really the choice before them now as it stands.
Jessica, if we were to just think a little further now, if the ban is indeed imposed, how would such a ban work across the nation at least?
Well, yeah, there is already legislation that's been proposed by the Senate to do what's called allowing Washington to prevent certain foreign governments, it says, from exploiting technology services in a way that poses risk to Americans' data. Now, that Senate bill was proposed and immediately backed by the White House. The White House has come out in favor of it. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying that the White House supports that effort. And meantime, the House, which also needs to generate a version of this bill, has begun to do so. In order to move quickly through Congress, both of those houses need to get together on a joint bill, propose it, pass it, and have the president sign it. But should that happen, that would absolutely execute the type of ban that we're talking about. And it just proves that the ban has political momentum. But it also, as some Democrats have pointed out, has political costs, because the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, who's likely to have to administer the law that's been proposed in the Senate, says, you know, this could really cost us votes, because most people under 35 use TikTok. They could be angry about this ban. We don't want Democrats to lose elections because under 35-year-olds are voting against our party because we put this limit into place. So a lot to consider by U.S. politicians over this issue. Shivan?
Glad to have you here with us, Jessica. Thank you for all those updates.